It's probably quite appropriate that I speak after we've just heard Treasury speaking, because really what I'm going to speak about is directly related to what you've just heard. Okay, so the first thing that I heard was countercyclicality, and countercyclicality was the notion of being able to spend to generate growth in an environment where there is no growth, right? Sounds plausible, sounds logical. I'd say that probably sounds like prudent strategy. And for the most part, I'd say it is. Okay, so I don't have a problem with that. What you need perspective on, though, is that countercyclicality that they're referring to is effectively debt spending. Even in good times, government borrows in order to spend. In bad times, they borrow more. Okay. So in 2008, 2009, you saw the dip in the revenue collections. Well, the spending didn't dip at all. The spending stayed exactly as it was. So proportionate to the amount of tax that they collected, government borrowed significantly more. So we had a huge budget deficit created as a result of that. In the years that followed, well, we heard that South Africa is growing, but it's not growing particularly strongly. So the implication there was, okay, so we still need to be countercyclical because the growth isn't strong enough. That's the implication. The net result is that you'll end up borrowing more, and you'll end up borrowing more, and you'll end up borrowing more. Now, there was an inconsistency that I heard as well, and the inconsistency speaks exactly to the point that I'm going to be talking about. And the inconsistency was the notion of intergenerational fairness. Did you guys pick that up? Okay, so what is intergenerational fairness? Intergenerational fairness is that you don't want to lumber your kids' generation with the debt that you've accumulated in your own. It necessarily requires that you are as prudent as you possibly can be now, and in fact even more so that you can offer your children's generation a debt unencumbered future, a future where they're not having to pay off any of the problems that you've created. The problem that I have is that there's nothing fair about what's going on at the moment. So if you have a look at our budget deficits now, and it's not something that he put up on screen, which I would have loved to have seen and shown you, is that our budget deficits now are not far off what they were in the crisis times in 08 and 09. Now, what does that tell you? Far from being counter-cyclical, what it tells me is that there's a real rigidity in government spending, that once it gets to a particular point, it's very difficult to scale it back. How do you tell people that are on social welfare that they can't get what they used to get because the tax pile's smaller? Politically, it's almost impossible, and especially not if you're approaching elections as we are. Okay, so a little bit of perspective there. So you're going to see in October, when they print their miniature budget, that in fact the budget deficit is looking way worse than what they told us it would be in March. And if you go and compare that to what it was in 09, you'll see just how little progress government has made in being able to rein in that deficit. And insofar as intergenerational fairness is concerned, I would put it to you that in fact the trend is going entirely in the wrong direction. Okay, so just something for you guys to keep the back of your minds. Now, why is that relevant? Well, it's relevant because governments are notorious, and specifically democratic governments are notorious for politicizing economics. And the problem with politicizing economics is that more often than not, it lands up becoming promises that ultimately need to be funded somehow. And if those promises aren't funded out of tax collections, they are funded out of debt. And so whether you look at America, whether you look at Europe, or whether you look at Japan, you look at Asia, look at China, look at South Africa, look at even African countries that are growing a lot more strongly, look at South America, it doesn't matter where you look. What you will find is that governments are building debt. They've all got their debt piles, they just vary in size. Now, why is that significant? Well, it's significant. Let's just think of it in terms of a very simplistic example. You go to a party, and at that party there's cake, and you want some of that cake, and so you eat cake, and so there's a natural demand for that cake, and lots of people are like you, they also want some of that cake, and so there's demand for cake. Now what happens if you are given more cake and more cake? There comes a point where, well, for a while that's quite nice, you know, why not? Trained hard at gym, the whole thing, I can do with a little bit of cake. Except that it gets to a point where after about your fourth or fifth piece of cake, you actually just don't want cake anymore. You start feeling a little bit sick, you know. So at that point, what happens to the demand for cake? The demand for cake starts to taper off, if not stop altogether. Now, debt markets, which is where governments finance themselves, work on similar principles, right? So there's a demand for debt because the people that buy that debt, or the people rather that loan the money, generate interest return on that money. In the same way that you got shown that example of the company borrowing money from the bank and there was interest attached to it. It works the same way between government and the private sector. So government borrows from the private sector earns interest revenue off the money that it lends government. So you can look at that dynamic as a debt market. And a debt market works like any other. There's a supply of debt, in other words, people wanting to borrow money, and there's a demand for debt, people wanting to lend the money. Okay. And it's important that in free market economics, there's always going to be supply and demand issues that determine those market dynamics. So if there's not much demand out there to lend money, the only time that you're really going to be able to entice people to lend money is if you give them an interest rate so high that they just feel compelled to lend money at that rate because they know they're generating a really good return. So if it's a really risky proposition, if you tight on money and your friend asks you for a few bucks, you know, it's really not an attractive proposition until that friend tells you that they'll pay you double back if you just lend it to them for a month. All of a sudden, hell, that's fantastic, you'll lend the money. So there's a dynamic there that takes place. But in the same way that when you are given too much cake, eventually you turn around and say, no, I don't want it anymore, debt markets work almost according to the same principle. Okay, so it's to say that governments can borrow up to a point, but at the point where they issue too much, if they issue too much debt, in other words, they create this debt out of basically issuing bonds, which is a claim on government tax flows. If they issue too many of these bonds, the market is going to look at this at some point and say, you know what, we actually can't absorb any of this anymore. We simply can't absorb this anymore. You guys have borrowed yourselves up to your eyeballs. You're issuing this debt, but we're now looking at this. It's such a risky proposition. I'm just not comfortable lending you money anymore. So what happens? Well, one thing certainly happens is that the only way to entice those people to lend those governments a lot more money is that interest rates rise. But as you know, what happens when interest rates rise? If you own a home and you've got a bond on that home and interest rates rise, what happens? It's a lot harder to pay off that debt. It makes life very uncomfortable. And of course, in the case of a government that generates its revenues out of taxes, and its taxes, look at it more or less as a fixed pool, if it's having to pay more on interest payments, it's having to disperse less elsewhere in the economy. So clearly that's not a comfortable position to be in. As I said, there's a problem, there's a rigidity in government spending where once it gets to a particular level, it doesn't want to come back down. It's very difficult to bring it back down because you've got to tell people that they're not allowed to have as much as what they had in the past. Yet they're still paying the taxes. So how is that possible, or why? Why does that happen? Okay, so now what do you guys know about quantitative easing? Who knows something about quantitative easing?
As far as I know, quantitative easing is pushing more money into the economy to stimulate it.
Okay.
It's the opposite of austerity where you cut back on the spending.
Okay, good. All right, so that's one aspect of it. But effectively, why quantitative easing comes about in the first place is that the markets have had their fill of debt. They can't stomach any more debt. Interest rates are starting to rise. The central bank now looks at interest rates rising and they're saying, no, hang on a second, we didn't authorize this rise in interest rates. We don't want interest rates to rise. We want interest rates to stay low. Why? Because, well, in theory, supposedly lower interest rates means that people have greater flexibility to pay off their loans. In other words, I suppose if you look at it on a piece of paper, that makes sense. In practice, I can tell you that never works. Okay. In practice, what happens is you give people the flexibility by lowering interest rates. What do? They spend it. Exactly. Yeah. Speak to my wife; she'll tell you all about it. So that theory doesn't work. But what they do know is that in periods of higher interest rates or rising interest rates, GDP growth slows down. And when GDP growth slows down, tax collections slow down. Now you get where I'm going with all of this. It's a completely undesirable position for the government to see interest rates rising, their interest burden on their fiscus rising, where they have to pull money away from places where they don't want to pull the money away from. So really this is an unacceptable situation and we've got to do something about this. So off we go speak to the central bank. So Mr. Central Bank, we need help here. I need you to help me lower these interest rates again. Now the central bank looks at it and says, well, yeah, I've lowered my interest rates. Look, my central bank policy is as low as it can go. I can't take my interest rate much further. The only thing that I can do is I can create money because I'm the central bank. And if you have a look at the US central bank, they have an exorbitant privilege in that the world uses their currency as a store of value. They have an exorbitant privilege that most other countries, barring Japan and maybe Europe and maybe the UK, don't have. So what does the central bank do? Well, the central bank can go and create this money. Now, guys, they don't sit there with a printing press. It's not like someone sitting in front of a computer hitting Control P the whole time printing notes. It's not the way it happens. It's a book entry. Okay? It's a book entry that sits in the balance sheets of banks and of the central bank and a whole complicated system. But effectively what they do is they create book entries that allow the central bank to effectively go into the debt markets, and there where the private sector has now had its fill and is not generating more demand for that debt, they step in and create that additional demand. So there where the private sector was saying, no, hang on a second, I've had it up to here with debt. I can't consume any more debt. The only way you're going to get me to consume more debt is if I put interest rates up here. The central bank steps in and says, no, don't worry, guys. We'll buy the debt. We'll buy the debt. So the central bank, through creating some book entries and effectively creating money, steps into what they call the secondary market. It's the market that everybody trades out there, and it buys those government bonds. So effectively, the central bank, through creating money, has bought and is assisting the government to continue with its countercyclical government spending. Because, as we quite rightly heard, that feels a lot more palatable to them than going through austerity. Now, don't get me started on austerity, because that in and of itself is a huge misnomer. Austerity to a politician and to a government official is nothing more than what you people live through every single day of your lives. Austerity is nothing more than living within your means. Now, in the same way that you guys look at your finances every month and you say, right, well, what can I afford and what can't I afford? And you will live accordingly. And sure, you can borrow a little bit here and there, but you're not going to do it stupidly, and you're not going to put yourself into so much debt that you go in default and get blacklisted and whatnot. So you live within your means. Somewhere along the lines, those lines got blurred with governments. And so austerity's become this big evil word. Austerity is actually nothing more than living within your means. That's what it is. Except that to do so, when all you've been doing for the past decade is living on borrowed money, is very difficult to do. Okay, it requires a rebalancing of the whole system. It requires you to retrench your consumption habits, to stop spending like you're spending. That's what it requires. And of course, that's a very unpleasant experience. I mean, if you used to going to a restaurant every second evening to eat, and you're used to shopping in Sandton City every weekend because you got all this money that you've got off this credit card and that credit card and the other credit card, and you do that for a couple of years, it becomes entrenched into your character. This is how you live. And then all of a sudden you get told, no, hang on a second, you can't do that anymore. You've got to live within your means. So you're cutting up your credit cards. It's a painful process. It's not a comfortable place to be. And it certainly isn't positive from a GDP growth perspective. But is it sustainable? Hell yes. That is sustainability. What we're doing with quantitative easing is creating a mechanism by which governments don't have to answer to those principles. So governments can continue spending, ratcheting up bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger debt piles as time goes on, and they're able to do so because their own central bank is monetizing that debt. The theory goes that if we push hard enough on the countercyclicality, in other words, if government spends hard enough in the economy, and you heard about all the infrastructural spending, we're going to spend even more on infrastructure that we potentially don't need, and we're going to spend even more in the economy and employ more people to create more inefficiencies in government, etc., etc., etc. That's a positive because, according to Keynes's theories, there's what they call a positive feedback loop. It's called the Keynesian multiplier. In other words, you spend $1 and you get $1.50 back in terms of GDP growth. Well, that's been proven through the course of the past decade patently false. It doesn't happen that way. What's happened is that debt levels have gradually built up. So what is all this to say? All this to say is that quantitative easing is the monetization of debt. It's the monetization of debt to help government finance deficit spending. It's nothing to be particularly positive about. And I look at the debates that are going on between Europe and America. Now, Europe has adopted the austerity route. America has adopted the quantitative easing route. America is currently generating growth, and Europe isn't. And so automatically one looks at the two and says, well, obviously America is doing the right thing. The problem isn't the here and now. You see, when you conduct these sorts of policies and you're going to look at things like intergenerational fairness, you can't be looking at now. You need to be looking at 10 and 20 years ahead. Okay. And so the one thing that I can say is when I look at a country like Greece, for example, that's been through 6 years worth of recession. They're in their 5th year of recession, 6 years next year, which I anticipate will probably unfold. That's been the result of austerity. Okay, doesn't look pretty. Youth unemployment is sitting at over 50%. Their economy has contracted by some 25%. So people will look at that and say, well, you see, George, that's exactly the reason why you don't want to go austerity. And I'll say, no, you missed the point completely. You see, if we're talking about austerity versus QE, the horses bolted 10 years ago. Long time ago. Governments were adopting the wrong policies. That's how we got to this point to begin with. Okay. You don't get yourself out of a debt hole by accumulating more debt. You get yourself out of a debt hole by learning to live within your means. So, QE, as far as I'm concerned, it certainly shouldn't be looked at in a positive way, because in truth, history will judge it, not now and not within the next 5 years, but in 20 years' time. 20 years' time, we'll look back and what's happening here and now and wondering, what were we thinking? Well, that's our perspective at least. Now, if it's one positive that happens out of quantitative easing is that you generate the potential to create inflation. That's the idea. They want to create inflation. Why do they want to create inflation? Well, because in the same way that inflation makes you poorer by eating into your disposable income, it also eats into the level of your debt, right? So if you have a house worth $1 million and you have inflation every year, which raises your salary by roughly that proportion every year, in 5 years' time, you're sitting, if you could afford it 5 years ago, $1 million 5 years ago, and now it should be a lot cheaper, no? Just because your salary's increased through the course of time, but your bond hasn't. Okay? So the point is, that's what they try to achieve. So the way out, in theory, from quantitative easing is that you deflate the debt away by creating inflation, and you also try and grow your economy to a point where the combination of inflation and growth slowly rebalance the numbers. In theory, that's the way it's supposed to work. Let's just have a look at fact. So fact is, America has been running QE since 2009. In that time, their debt has done nothing but rise. The Congressional Budget Office just recently released their forecast for next year, and they are still printing a budget deficit of around 4.5% of GDP. Their growth is only 2.5% of GDP, and that's on a good year. In other words, their debt piles are still growing over and above that. So my point to you here today is be wary of quantitative easing, understand what it is. Understand that it exists because of this counter-cyclical type of policies that government push out into the world. Understand that it exists because politicians and governments have a great deal of difficulty in scaling back their expenditures relative to their tax collections. Understand that it is a highly politicized issue and that central banks are no longer independent of government. They work hand in glove. And that's a fact. Okay. So I hope I've created a little bit of perspective here on what quantitative easing is and how it's come about, and potentially what you need to look out for with regards to quantitative easing. But whilst you hear all the positive stories out of America and all the negative stories out of Europe, just keep perspective on what's actually going on, where you've got one region trying to rebalance itself and make itself more sustainable in another region that absolutely isn't. Okay, thank you.